July 20th, 1944. 12:42 p.m. The Wolf's Lair, Rastenburg, East Prussia. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's fingers trembled as he excused himself from the conference room, muttering something about a phone call that couldn't wait. Through the open window, he watched Adolf Hitler lean over the oak map table, studying invasion reports from Normandy with his usual obsessive intensity. In exactly 8 minutes, that table would be splinters, the Führer would be dead, and Germany would be free. Stauffenberg had left his briefcase containing 2 pounds of British plastic explosive directly beneath the table, no more than 6 feet from Hitler's position. The modified fuses, smuggled from British supplies captured in North Africa, would detonate at 12:50 precisely. Every calculation, every rehearsal, every contingency plan pointed to the same conclusion. No one could survive that blast in that confined space. Yet as Stauffenberg hurried toward the waiting car that would take him to the airfield, he carried a terrible secret. The meeting location had been changed at the last moment. Instead of the reinforced concrete bunker where the blast would have been absolutely lethal, Hitler had moved the conference to a wooden barracks with windows on 3 sides. The physics of the explosion would be fundamentally different. The pressure wave that should have pulverized everyone in the room would instead vent through those windows, dissipating force that should have killed. Stauffenberg didn't know this yet. He was climbing into the staff car, confident that within minutes Hitler would be dead, and the conspiracy he led, hundreds of officers, politicians, and resistance members positioned across Germany, would seize control of the Reich and negotiate peace with the Allies. The mathematics of the coup seemed perfect. Total surprise, coordinated timing, complete preparation. Within hours, the conspirators would discover that mathematics meant nothing when confronted with architectural accident and impossible luck. The explosion that should have killed Hitler would instead trigger the most savage purge in German military history, resulting in over 5,000 executions and revealing a resistance network that had operated for years within the very heart of the Nazi regime. The conspiracy that culminated in that briefcase bomb had origins reaching back to the earliest days of Hitler's rule. September 1938, Munich. General Ludwig Beck, chief of the German General Staff, submitted his resignation to Adolf Hitler in protest of the planned invasion of Czechoslovakia. Beck's resignation letter, preserved in military archives, revealed the fundamental split within the German officer corps that would eventually produce Stauffenberg's bomb. I hold it impossible for a soldier of integrity to participate in a war that I am convinced will end in military catastrophe for Germany. The General Staff exists to provide military counsel based on strategic reality, not to implement political fantasies regardless of tactical impossibility. If the Führer insists on this course, he does so against the unanimous advice of his military leadership. I cannot in good conscience remain part of a command structure that has been reduced to blind obedience. Beck's resignation, accepted with cold fury by Hitler, marked the beginning of organized military resistance. Beck had expected other senior generals to resign in solidarity, forcing Hitler to reconsider his aggressive policies. Every single general remained in post. The first lesson the resistance learned: individual conscience meant nothing without coordinated action and willingness to accept extreme consequences. The early resistance networks formed gradually through 1939 and 1940, composed primarily of conservative military officers, aristocrats, and civil servants who viewed Hitler as a dangerous revolutionary, destroying traditional German institutions. These were not Democrats or idealists, but pragmatic conservatives who believed Hitler's reckless policies would destroy Germany. Major General Henning von Treschow, who had become the conspiracy's strategic mastermind, summarized the early resistance philosophy in a letter to his wife, written in December 1939. We do not oppose the Führer because we love democracy or despise nationalism. We oppose him because he is leading Germany to absolute destruction through wars we cannot win and policies that violate every principle of Christian civilization. A soldier's duty is not blind obedience, but service to the fatherland. When those two come into conflict, the fatherland must prevail. This distinction, patriotic duty versus regime loyalty, would sustain the conspiracy through years of preparation, setbacks, and growing horror at Nazi atrocities. The transformation of conservative opposition into active conspiracy to commit assassination required a psychological journey that few could complete. Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, who survived the war to testify at Nuremberg, described the moral evolution. In 1940, I believed Hitler should be removed from power through legal means, perhaps forced retirement or military intervention. By 1942, after witnessing the massacres in Russia firsthand, I understood that legal methods were impossible. The regime had destroyed all legal constraints. Only assassination remained. This meant accepting that I would become a murderer, a traitor, and would certainly be executed if I failed. The question was whether my personal damnation mattered compared to ending the crimes being committed in Germany's name. Gersdorf would attempt his own assassination of Hitler in March 1943, planning to detonate explosives strapped to his own body during a ceremony at the Berlin Arsenal. Hitler departed early, before Gersdorf could approach close enough to guarantee success. The conspiracy's organizational structure evolved from loose networks into sophisticated cells by 1943, centered around several key figures whose coordination would prove both the plot's greatest strength and ultimate weakness. General Friedrich Olbricht, head of the General Army Office in Berlin, controlled the administrative machinery necessary to implement a military coup. He drafted Operation Valkyrie, supposedly a contingency plan to maintain order in case of internal unrest, but actually designed to allow the arrest of SS and Nazi Party officials under cover of legitimate military orders. The genius of Valkyrie was its legal appearance. Reserve army units would receive orders to secure government buildings, communication centers, and arrest designated individuals, all under authority of legitimate military directives signed by proper commanders. Only after the coup succeeded would anyone realize those orders had been issued by conspirators. Major General Tresckow, serving as operations officer for Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, managed the military coordination and recruited junior officers who would carry out actual assassination attempts. His position gave him access to Hitler during periodic strategy conferences at various headquarters. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg entered the conspiracy in September 1943 after recovering from catastrophic wounds suffered in Tunisia. A British aircraft had strafed his staff car, costing him his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand. The injuries that should have ended his career instead drove him toward the conspiracy with fanatic determination. Major General Stieff, chief of the organization branch of the Army High Command, provided access to British plastic explosives captured in North Africa. The material was more reliable and powerful than German military explosives, critical for devices that needed to fit in briefcases or coat pockets. Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, led civilian coordination and would become chancellor after the coup succeeded. His network included judges, police officials, and administrative personnel who would assume government positions in the post-Hitler regime. The conspiracy's scope was staggering. By July 1944, the organization included at least 200 active members directly involved in coup planning, with another 5,000 individuals aware of the plot or positioned to support it after Hitler's death. The scale created both power and vulnerability. So many people knowing meant someone would eventually betray the conspiracy or make a mistake that exposed it to Gestapo investigation. The attempts to kill Hitler before Stauffenberg's final effort revealed the enormous difficulties of assassinating a man who survived through paranoid security measures, erratic schedule changes, and supernatural luck. March 13, 1943. Tresco arranged for a package containing British plastic explosives disguised as bottles of Cointreau liqueur to be placed aboard Hitler's personal aircraft during a visit to Army Group Center headquarters in Smolensk. The bomb was set to explode 30 minutes after takeoff, destroying the aircraft over Soviet-held territory where crash investigation would be impossible. The explosive failed to detonate. The chemical fuse, designed to work at room temperature, froze in the unheated cargo hold. Trescow's courier retrieved the package the next day, discovering the bomb had simply failed to function. The margin between success and failure, a few degrees of temperature. November 1943. Multiple conspirators attempted to assassinate Hitler during public appearances in Munich commemorating the beer hall putsch. Each attempt failed due to last-minute schedule changes or inadequate access. Hitler's paranoia manifested in unpredictable patterns. He would cancel appearances minutes before scheduled times, change routes without notice, and maintain security protocols that made close approach nearly impossible. December 1943 through February 1944. At least 4 additional assassination attempts were planned but abandoned when Hitler either failed to appear at expected locations or security conditions made success impossible. The pattern was maddening. Every failure increased the risk of discovery, while Nazi atrocities accelerated. Stauffenberg and other conspirators received regular reports of massacres in occupied territories, death camp operations, and war crimes that made the moral calculus simple. Every day Hitler lived meant thousands more deaths. The selection of Stauffenberg as the final assassin resulted from necessity rather than preference. By July 1944, he was one of the few conspirators with regular access to Hitler's military conferences. His position as Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Reserve Army required his presence at strategy briefings. His war wounds provided perfect cover for carrying a briefcase into meetings. He genuinely needed the briefcase to carry documents he couldn't hold otherwise. Most critically, his injuries exempted him from the personal searches that other officers endured. SS security officers assumed a one-eyed, one-handed cripple posed no physical threat. This assumption would nearly kill Hitler. Stauffenberg's personal motivation combined moral outrage with cold, strategic calculation. In a conversation with his brother Berthold in June 1944, recorded in Berthold's diary, Klaus explained his thinking. "I know this will fail. The odds of killing Hitler and successfully implementing Valkyrie are perhaps 1 in 10, but the attempt must be made. Germany must demonstrate to the world that not all Germans supported Hitler, that resistance existed within the military and government. If we do nothing, future generations will believe all Germans were complicit in the crimes committed. We must act, even if we die, so that history records that some Germans chose honor over obedience." The final preparation involved solving technical problems that seemed insurmountable. The explosive device needed to fit in a briefcase, detonate reliably, provide sufficient force to kill everyone in the room, and use a fuse that Stauffenberg could activate with one hand while appearing to simply pack his briefcase. Captain Friedrich Karl Klausing, Stauffenberg's aide-de-camp, worked with captured British explosives to create a bomb that met these specifications. The final device consisted of 2 pounds of plastic explosive wrapped around a modified chemical fuse that would detonate after a 10-minute delay. The fuse was activated by breaking a glass vial containing acid that would eat through a wire, releasing a spring-loaded firing pin. Stauffenberg could break the vial by crushing it with pliers, a motion he could perform with his 3 remaining fingers while appearing to organize papers. The morning of July 20th, 1944 began with Stauffenberg flying from Berlin to Rastenburg in East Prussia, carrying 2 bombs in his briefcase along with genuine military documents. The plan called for him to activate both bombs during a bathroom break, place the briefcase under the conference table as close to Hitler as possible, excuse himself, and depart the compound before the explosion. Captain Werner von Haften, accompanying Stauffenberg as his aide, would help prepare the bombs and create distraction if needed. The flight took 3 hours. During the journey, Stauffenberg reviewed the Coup timeline one final time. The bomb would explode at approximately 12:50 p.m. He and Haften would be airborne, returning to Berlin when the explosion occurred. General Albrecht in Berlin would receive confirmation of Hitler's death and immediately activate Operation Valkyrie. Reserve army units would receive orders to secure government buildings throughout Germany. SS and Gestapo officials would be arrested under authority of emergency military law, and communications would be seized to prevent Nazi party resistance. The provisional government under Goerdeler would announce Hitler's death and Germany's willingness to negotiate peace with Western allies. The entire sequence would execute within 4 hours, presenting the Allies with a new German government before any resistance could organize. The timeline began disintegrating the moment Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, informed Stauffenberg that the conference had been moved from the concrete bunker to a wooden barracks because of summer heat. The meeting time had been moved forward by 30 minutes to 12:30 p.m., because Mussolini was arriving later that afternoon, and Hitler wanted the military briefing completed before the Italian delegation appeared. These changes, trivial from Keitel's perspective, were catastrophic for the assassination plan. The wooden building would disperse the blast. The earlier start time meant less preparation time. Worse, Stauffenberg discovered he would have less than 5 minutes alone to prepare both bombs. In the bathroom, working frantically with his 3 fingers, Stauffenberg managed to arm one bomb. Haften knocked on the door, signaling that Keitel was becoming impatient about the delay. Stauffenberg made an instant decision: proceed with one bomb rather than risk exposure by taking more time. He wrapped the armed explosive in a shirt inside his briefcase and left the second bomb with Haften. The single bomb would generate approximately 50% of the planned explosive force. In the concrete bunker, this reduction might not have mattered. In the wooden barracks, it would prove fatal to the conspiracy. At 12:37 p.m., Stauffenberg entered the conference room. 24 people crowded around the heavy oak map table, studying reports from the collapsing Eastern Front. Hitler stood at the middle of one long side, leaning on the table with both hands. Stauffenberg worked his way around the table, placing his briefcase on the floor, pushing it with his foot toward Hitler's position. He positioned it approximately 6 feet from where Hitler stood. Optimal placement would have been directly beneath Hitler, but the crowded room and his disability made closer approach impossible without drawing attention. At 12:42 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself, claiming he needed to take an urgent phone call from Berlin. No one questioned his departure. Staff officers frequently received calls during these interminable briefings. Outside, he walked calmly toward the car where Haften waited with the second bomb. The guards at the compound gate, recognizing Stauffenberg as a staff officer who had just entered for the conference, waved him through without inspection. At 12:50 p.m., as Stauffenberg's car approached the outer checkpoint, the bomb exploded. The blast was enormous, visible as a column of smoke from half a mile away. The wooden barracks seemed to disintegrate, with walls blown outward and the roof collapsing inward. Stauffenberg, watching from the car, saw the destruction and reached the only conclusion possible. No one could have survived that explosion. He was wrong. The same wooden construction that made the blast visible also saved Hitler's life. In a concrete bunker, the pressure wave would have reflected off walls, creating a crushing force that would have pulverized human bodies. In the wooden barracks, the walls and windows blew out, venting the pressure. The heavy oak table, which would have been shredded in a bunker explosion, remained partially intact, shielding those crouched beneath it. Hitler, leaning on the table at the moment of explosion, was thrown to the floor with burst eardrums, burns on his legs, and wood splinters embedded in his back. 4 others died. Colonel Heinz Brandt, General Günther Korten, General Rudolf Schmundt, and Hitler's stenographer, Heinrich Berger. But Hitler stood up, walked out of the ruins, and within 30 minutes was coherent enough to understand what had happened. Stauffenberg, meanwhile, had convinced the guard at the outer checkpoint that the explosion was an Allied bombing raid. The guard, seeing smoke and hearing secondary explosions from ammunition stored near the barracks, accepted this explanation and allowed Stauffenberg to depart. By 1:15 p.m. he was airborne to Berlin, absolutely convinced Hitler was dead. The next 6 hours would demonstrate how a coup could unravel when its fundamental premise proved false. In Berlin, General Olbricht received Stauffenberg's first report by phone at 1 p.m. The bomb exploded. Hitler must be dead. Initiate Valkyrie. Olbricht faced an impossible dilemma. Stauffenberg's report was certain, but Olbricht had no independent confirmation. If he activated Valkyrie based on a false report, the conspiracy would be exposed and everyone involved would be executed. He decided to wait for confirmation. This delay proved catastrophic. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's survival became known within minutes of the explosion. By 1:30 p.m., the SS had sealed the compound and begun investigating. They discovered Stauffenberg's briefcase remnants near the table and quickly determined that an assassination attempt had occurred. By 2 p.m., witnesses reported seeing Stauffenberg leave the conference room minutes before the explosion. The SS issued orders for his arrest. In Berlin, Olbricht waited for confirmation until 3 p.m., wasting 2 precious hours while Hitler's survival was being confirmed and reported throughout the Reich. When Stauffenberg landed in Berlin at 3:45 p.m. and telephoned Olbricht insisting Hitler was dead, Olbricht finally activated Valkyrie. Reserve army units began receiving orders to secure government buildings and arrest SS officials. But by this time, Hitler was on the telephone to Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels in Berlin, very much alive and furious. The coup's execution demonstrated both the sophistication of the conspiracy's planning and the impossibility of succeeding once the central premise failed. In Berlin, Major Otto Ernst Remer commanded the Guard battalion responsible for government security. He received Valkyrie orders at 4 p.m. to arrest Goebbels and other Nazi officials. Remer, a decorated combat veteran but politically naive, followed his orders and surrounded Goebbels' residence. Goebbels, learning of Remer's arrival, invited him inside and handed him a telephone. "Before you arrest me, perhaps you should speak with the Führer." Hitler, on the line, promoted Remer to colonel on the spot and ordered him to crush the coup. This single conversation reversed the entire Berlin operation. Remer's battalion, which should have been the conspirators' enforcement arm, became their executioners. Across Germany, reserve army commanders received conflicting orders. Valkyrie directives instructed them to arrest SS and Nazi Party officials. But simultaneous communications from the Wolf's Lair confirmed Hitler's survival and ordered the arrest of anyone implementing Valkyrie. In some cities, officers arrested Nazis before learning Hitler lived. In others, commanders refused to implement Valkyrie without clearer authority. The result was chaos rather than coordinated action. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, military governor of France and a key conspirator, successfully arrested 200 SS and Gestapo personnel before learning the coup had failed. He had no choice but to release them and attempt to claim the arrests were a military exercise. The SS didn't believe him. At the Bendler Block building in Berlin, where the conspiracy's leaders had gathered to coordinate the coup, the situation collapsed into tragedy. By 7 p.m. it was clear Hitler had survived and Valkyrie had failed. Officers who had supported the coup began defecting, realizing that continued participation meant certain death. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army and nominal superior to Olbricht and Stauffenberg, had known about the conspiracy but refused to actively participate. When Valkyrie failed, From attempted to save himself by ordering the immediate arrest of the conspirators in his own headquarters. A brief confrontation ensued in which From was temporarily detained by conspirators, but loyalist officers freed him by 11 Satars p.m. From, desperate to prove his loyalty and eliminate witnesses to his knowledge of the plot, convened an immediate court-martial. At midnight on July 20th, in the courtyard of the Bendler block, Stauffenberg, Ulbricht Haeften, and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim were executed by firing squad. General Beck was allowed to commit suicide, but botched the attempt and had to be finished by a sergeant. From's summary executions denied Hitler the show trials he wanted, but they did nothing to protect From himself. He was arrested by the SS the next day and later executed for failing to prevent the conspiracy despite knowing of its existence. The purge that followed Operation Valkyrie exceeded even the conspirators' worst nightmares. The Gestapo arrested over 7,000 people in the subsequent months. Of these, approximately 5,000 were executed after perfunctory trials before the People's Court, presided over by Judge Roland Freisler, who conducted proceedings with screaming denunciations and predetermined verdicts. The executions were designed for maximum humiliation and suffering. Condemned conspirators were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, a process that caused slow strangulation rather than quick death. Hitler ordered many executions filmed so he could watch them repeatedly. Among those executed were nearly all the conspiracy's leaders. General Ludwig Beck, already dead by suicide on July 20th, was spared trial. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who would have become Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht in the new government, was hanged on August 8th. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence and a conspiracy supporter, was arrested and eventually hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. General Friedrich Ulbricht was already dead, executed on July 20th. Major General Henning von Treschow, learning of the coup's failure while serving on the Eastern Front, walked into no man's land on July 21st and detonated a grenade, staging his death to appear as combat casualties rather than giving the Gestapo the satisfaction of a trial. His final words to his aide: "In a few hours I shall stand before God, answering for my actions and omissions. I believe I can, with a clear conscience, stand by all I have done in the battle against Hitler. Just as God once promised Abraham that he would spare Sodom if only 10 righteous men could be found in the city, I also have reason to hope that, for our sake, he will not destroy Germany." The civilian conspirators suffered equally brutal fates. Karl Goerdeler, who was traveling when the coup failed, went into hiding but was captured on August 12th. He was tortured extensively to reveal other conspirators before being hanged on February 2, 1945. Julius Lieber, Social Democrat politician and conspiracy member, was arrested and hanged on January 5, 1945. Ulrich von Hassel, former ambassador and conspiracy supporter, was executed on September 8, 1944. The purge extended to family members under the Nazi doctrine of Sippenhaft, collective family punishment. Wives, children, and relatives of executed conspirators were arrested and imprisoned. Stauffenberg's wife Nina was arrested along with their 4 children, including a son born after Stauffenberg's death. They survived the war in custody but endured terrible conditions. The breadth of the purge revealed how extensively the resistance network had penetrated the German military and government. Officers who had merely known about the plot without actively participating were executed. Soldiers who had expressed anti-Nazi sentiments in the presence of conspirators were arrested. The officer corps, already depleted by years of war, was gutted by the removal of thousands of experienced commanders. The immediate strategic impact of Valkyrie's failure was catastrophic for Germany. Hitler, already paranoid about military advice, became convinced the army leadership was treasonous. He replaced professional military judgment with ideological loyalty as the primary criterion for command. Officers who survived the purge understood that any disagreement with Hitler's decisions could be interpreted as disloyalty, punishable by death. The military planning that might have minimized Germany's defeat became impossible when no one dared contradict Hitler's increasingly delusional strategic directives. The introduction of the raised-arm Nazi salute as mandatory for all military personnel, replacing the traditional military salute, symbolized the complete subordination of professional military culture to Nazi ideology. The psychological impact on surviving officers and soldiers was profound. Captain Axel von dem Busche, who had volunteered for an earlier assassination attempt that was cancelled due to scheduling changes, survived the war to describe the aftermath. We had believed that honor, duty, and conscience could coexist with military service. Operation Valkyrie's failure proved that under Hitler's regime, they could not. Every officer who survived the purge understood that we served a criminal regime. But we were given a choice: continue serving despite this knowledge, or die uselessly. Most of us chose to continue, believing we could still protect our soldiers or minimize the destruction. This rationalization haunts me still. We knew what we served, yet we served anyway. The historical controversy surrounding Operation Valkyrie centers on several uncomfortable questions that lack simple answers. Were the conspirators heroes or traitors? From one perspective, they were patriots attempting to save Germany from total destruction by removing a leader whose policies guaranteed catastrophic defeat. From another perspective, they were officers who had sworn oaths of loyalty, planned to violate those oaths through murder, and only acted decisively when Germany's defeat became obvious rather than when Hitler's crimes began. Did they oppose Hitler because they recognized the moral evil of Nazism, or because they recognized he was losing the war? The evidence suggests both motives operated simultaneously. Trescow's writings demonstrate genuine moral revulsion at Nazi atrocities. Goerdeller's plans for a post-Hitler government included returning to pre-Nazi authoritarian structures, not establishing democracy. Most conspirators combined practical concerns about Germany's survival with moral objections to Nazi crimes, weighted differently for different individuals. Would the coup have ended the war earlier if Hitler had died? Almost certainly, but not as quickly or favorably as conspirators hoped. The provisional government planned to negotiate peace with Western allies while continuing to fight the Soviet Union, a strategy that ignored Allied policy of unconditional surrender and coordination with the Soviets. The Western allies would likely have demanded unconditional surrender from any German government, Nazi or otherwise, and would not have accepted a separate peace that excluded the Soviet Union. At best, a successful coup might have shortened the war by 3 to 6 months and prevented some of the destruction inflicted on Germany in the final phase of fighting. The Holocaust might have ended slightly earlier, potentially saving tens of thousands of lives, though the vast majority of victims were already dead by July 1944. Why did the conspiracy include so many aristocratic officers and so few working-class soldiers or ordinary citizens? The social composition reflected both the access required for assassination attempts and the conservative nature of the resistance. Aristocratic officers had the security clearances, positions, and personal relationships necessary to approach Hitler. Working-class citizens lacked such access and had been thoroughly monitored by the Gestapo since 1933, making resistance organization nearly impossible. The conservative character of the conspiracy focused on restoring traditional institutions rather than establishing democracy, limited its appeal to broader social classes. Communist resistance groups operated separately and were never integrated into the Valkyrie conspiracy, despite sharing the goal of removing Hitler. The technical question of why the bomb failed to kill Hitler despite generating massive destruction has multiple answers, all involving improbable luck. The change in location from concrete bunker to wooden barracks was decided hours before Stauffenberg's arrival and couldn't have been anticipated. The heavy oak table between the bomb and Hitler provided crucial shielding. Colonel Heinz Brandt, annoyed by the briefcase blocking his access to the map, moved it from where Stauffenberg had placed it to the far side of a heavy table leg support, further shielding Hitler. The wooden construction vented the blast pressure. Any single one of these factors alone might not have saved Hitler, but their combination reduced the explosion's lethality just enough for his survival. The moral complexity of the conspirators' position emerges most clearly in their final testimonies before execution. Many refused to express remorse, insisted they had acted from patriotic duty, and accepted death with composure that impressed even their executors. Field Marshal von Witzleben, standing before Freisler's People's Court, interrupted the judge's screaming denunciation. "You can hand us over to the executioner, but in 3 months the enraged and tormented people will call you to account and drag you alive through the streets." He was hanged hours later, but his prediction proved accurate when Freisler himself was killed by Allied bombing of the courthouse in February 1945. General Friedrich Olbricht's final words before execution captured the conspiracy's fundamental motivation. "We acted to save Germany from complete destruction. Whether we were right or wrong, history will judge. But we acted from conviction that our duty to the fatherland superseded our oath to Hitler. A soldier's first loyalty is to the nation, not to any individual leader." This distinction between regime loyalty and national loyalty sustained the conspiracy, but also created the moral ambiguity that surrounds it still. The conspirators were not Democrats or resistors in the sense of opposing authoritarianism itself. They were conservatives who believed Hitler had betrayed traditional German institutions and military honor. Their planned government would have been authoritarian, possibly anti-Semitic to some degree, and certainly not a liberal democracy. Yet they were willing to risk everything to end Hitler's regime at a time when doing so required extraordinary courage. The legacy of Operation Valkyrie for post-war Germany proved more significant than its immediate military impact. The conspiracy demonstrated that not all Germans had supported Hitler, that resistance existed within the military and government, and that some Germans had been willing to die opposing the regime. This knowledge became crucial to German post-war identity and rehabilitation. The Bendler Block building in Berlin, where Stauffenberg and others were executed, became a memorial to the German resistance. Streets, schools, and military installations were named after the conspirators. Their example allowed Germans to claim a tradition of internal resistance, however limited and flawed, rather than accepting collective guilt for Nazi crimes. Critics argue this legacy sanitizes the resistance by ignoring that most conspirators supported Hitler's early policies, participated in the aggressive wars that started in 1939, and only turned against him when defeat became inevitable. This criticism has validity, but also overlooks the genuine moral evolution many conspirators experienced and the real courage required to act, even belatedly. The strategic miscalculation that doomed Operation Valkyrie was not technical, but conceptual. The conspirators believed Hitler's death would automatically trigger regime collapse, that reserve army units would implement Valkyrie without question, and that Nazi party loyalty was shallow enough to dissolve once Hitler was gone. All three assumptions proved false. The regime's power rested not on Hitler personally, but on institutional structures, the SS, the Gestapo, the party apparatus, that would survive his death and immediately move to crush any coup. Reserve army commanders required clearer authority than a single bomb blast to violate their oaths and arrest Nazi officials. And Nazi party loyalty, especially among true believers like Goebbels, was fanatical enough to continue fighting even if Hitler died. The timing of the attempt in July 1944, when Germany's defeat was obvious, raised questions about the conspirators' motivations that they themselves struggled to answer. Why wait until defeat was certain? Why not act in 1938 or 1940 or 1942, when success might have prevented the war's worst atrocities? Tresckow addressed this question in a letter to Stauffenberg shortly before the July 20th attempt. The assassination must take place, whatever the cost. Even if it does not succeed, the attempt must be made. The practical purpose is to remove Hitler. But beyond that, we must demonstrate to the world and to future generations that German resistance existed and was willing to stake everything on the supreme sacrifice. Compared to this, nothing else matters. This suggests that by 1944, the conspirators understood they were acting as much for historical record as for practical military effect. The human cost of Valkyrie's failure extended far beyond the executed conspirators. Families destroyed, careers ruined, soldiers left leaderless when experienced officers were purged, civilians subjected to even more paranoid Nazi security measures, all resulted from a bomb that missed killing Hitler by perhaps 2 meters. The SS investigation following July 20th uncovered resistance networks that had operated for years, leading to arrests and executions of people who had never participated in assassination plans, but had expressed anti-Nazi views in private conversations. The culture of denunciation intensified as Germans informed on neighbors, colleagues, and even family members to prove their loyalty and avoid suspicion. The final accounting of Operation Valkyrie reveals a tragedy of miscalculation, mistiming, and impossible luck compounded by structural factors that made any internal coup nearly impossible by 1944. The bomb should have killed Hitler. The wooden barracks, moved table, and heavy oak support created just enough protection for survival. The coup should have proceeded once Hitler died, but without confirmation of death, crucial hours were wasted. Reserve army units should have implemented Valkyrie without question, but officers conditioned to obedience couldn't act decisively when confronted with conflicting authority. The provisional government should have negotiated peace quickly, but Allied policy demanded unconditional surrender, regardless of which Germans surrendered. In the end, Operation Valkyrie demonstrated both the courage of those who opposed Hitler and the near impossibility of internal resistance against a totalitarian regime that had spent a decade crushing dissent, monitoring populations, and demanding absolute loyalty. The conspirators weren't naive idealists, but experienced military officers who understood the risks and odds. They proceeded anyway, knowing failure meant torture and death, because they believed the attempt had to be made regardless of outcome. Stauffenberg's brother, Berthold, executed on August 10, 1944, reportedly told his executioner, "You may kill us, but our grandchildren will revere us as heroes." He was right. The Stauffenberg family name, disgraced in 1944, is now honored across Germany. The conspirators dismissed as traitors by Nazi propaganda are now recognized as patriots who placed loyalty to Germany above loyalty to Hitler. But the legacy remains complicated. They acted too late to prevent most Nazi crimes. Many had supported Hitler's early policies and only turned against him when defeat loomed. Their planned government would not have been democratic. They failed completely in their immediate objective and triggered a purge that killed thousands. Yet they also demonstrated that resistance existed, that some Germans chose conscience over compliance, and that the claim of just following orders was a choice, not an inevitability. Other Germans had refused to follow those orders, knowing refusal meant death. The moral example, however flawed and belated, mattered more than the tactical failure. The bomb that should have killed Hitler instead revealed a resistance that Hitler never completely crushed despite years of terror. In the mathematics of moral accounting, that revelation justified the sacrifice, even if the tactical failure guaranteed that sacrifice would be terrible and complete. The plotters died, but their example survived to complicate the Nazi narrative of total German support. That complication, that proof of internal opposition, became part of how Germany could eventually acknowledge its past while claiming a tradition, however limited, of resistance to it. The explosion at the Wolf's Lair failed to kill Hitler, but it did kill the myth that all Germans marched in lockstep with Nazi ideology until Allied armies forced surrender. Some Germans resisted. Some chose death over complicity. Some tried to kill Hitler in his own headquarters. They failed. But the attempt itself became their victory, a testimony carved in sacrifice that no amount of Nazi propaganda could completely erase.